started. Welcome to another week of the Behavior, Evolution, and Culture Seminar Series. Happy to have you here, and the list for the rest of the speakers for the quarter is up on the webpage at bec.ucla.edu, so check that out. And next week's talk is by Donna Johnson, who's at the University of Edinburgh, but he's actually here as a visiting scholar for So we're happy to have him next week. He's going to be talking about adaptive politics, strategic advantages, and psychological biases.
Yeah, you can go ahead.
So that's what's coming up next. And I announced this last week, but there is an extra talk that's going to be during on Wednesday of finals week. Christoph Bosch is coming, and it's going to be the regular time, 12 to 1:30, but it's on a Wednesday. And his at least title should be up momentarily in the session, hopefully by the end of the day, an abstract up soon. So please join us for that. And today I'm happy to welcome Mike Alvard from Texas A&M University, where he's an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology. And today's talk was co-sponsored by the Center for Southeast Asian Studies with generous support from Rob Lemelson's Indonesian Studies grant. So we're happy to have that support and some of them here to join us today. Welcome, Mike. He's going to be talking about Indonesia.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me here to the Center for Behavior, Evolution, and Culture. It seems like a great group that you have, and I'd like to thank Brooke for inviting me and Leo for working out all the details here. I've been in contact with him, so thanks a lot. And I guess also for the Center for Southeast Asian Studies. I appreciate that. Today I'm going to talk about social structure, cultural kinship, and cooperation among the Lamalera whale hunters of Indonesia, who I've been working with. Well, not working with them anymore, but I was working in the early 90s. And this gives you some idea of the overview of my talk today. I want to talk about human social complexity. It's sort of the big question about what makes people so special. Talk a little bit about cooperation using some game theory models, just to give you an introduction to the problems associated with cooperation. In the context of structure, I'm going to look at a number of different models that generate structure within social groups. We'll look at genetic kinship and also cultural kinship. And in La Molera, they organize themselves according to patrilineage. So I'm going to look at how lineage and affinal kinship, that is kinship via marriage, organizes whaling crews among these hunters in Indonesia. And then we'll show you some analysis, and then we'll have some discussion. But most of you know that people are special, and people are special in a lot of different ways. But what I'm interested in is the ultra-sociality of people. And some of you do research in this area. But as you know, people form really large groups of unrelated individuals. And it's manifest in a variety of different ways, including religion, nations, armies, tribes, this sorts of things. And this becomes really interesting in sort of comparative perspective when you consider that our nearest phylogenetic relatives, the gorillas, the African apes, and the chimps, rarely form communities larger than 100 individuals, right? So this is sort of, when I'm talking about people are special, this is what I'm interested in personally in my research, is how we come to the point of these large unrelated groups of folks, how we organize them into, how they get organized. Right. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with game theory, but game theory is a set of tools that people have used to look at the problems associated with cooperation. And the prisoner's dilemma is a common model to look at the problems associated with cooperation. And I'm not going to get into great detail with the prisoner's dilemma, but most of you know the parable. The prisoners are committed a crime, and they're being interrogated, and they have a choice. Each of them have a choice. They can either stay loyal to their partner, they can cooperate with their partner, or they can implicate their partner. And the structure of the payoff is set up such that it's income maximizing person will always defect. right? It always pays, if the other partner is cooperating, it pays for you to defect. If the other person is defecting, you don't want to be a sucker, and so you defect yourself. And so defect is the outcome when really both cooperating gives a greater return. This is the dilemma of cooperation that has guided a lot of research into cooperation. One of the points that I've made in a couple of my papers is that the prisoner's dilemma is not necessarily the best model for looking at human cooperation. And that's because a lot of cooperation is not altruistic. It's not altruism. In the prisoner's dilemma, if you cooperate, that's an act of altruism, right? And as we'll talk about a little bit later on today, there are other models of cooperation that are better than the prisoner's dilemma. And one of them is this idea of joint action for mutual benefit. And as we'll see in Lamalera, among the whale hunters, this seems to be a better model than the prisoner's dilemma. And some folks in the game theory world call this coordination, or games of coordination. And this was discussed by John Maynard Smith and Zathmary in their really wonderful book, The Major Transitions in Evolution, because one of the major transitions that they talk about is the ultra-sociality that you see with people. And they call it mutualism, but it's really coordination. And they talk about it as economies of scale that make the combined effect of individuals working together greater than the sum of their individual efforts, provided that the other players cooperate too. So the key, as we'll see, to coordination is getting the other individuals to cooperate as well. And if they cooperate, and if you cooperate, then there are great payoffs. Now, coordination problems are often illustrated with reference to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who some of you may know wrote, among other things, a Discourse on Equality. And he presented a parable called the stag hunt. And the stag hunt is a situation where it involves cooperative efforts to hunt the stag, and it requires at least 2 hunters. Right? No one can hunt a stag alone. Group effort is required to get the payoff from stag hunting. The problem is that there are hares, and hare can be taken alone. And in the parable, the per capita return from stag hunting is greater than that from hare. So stag hunting is preferable. But of course, killing a hare is better than obtaining nothing, which is what the lone stag hunter will obtain if his partner opts out. You see? So in the prisoner's dilemma game, it pays to defect no matter what. But in a coordination game, like the stag hunt here, it pays to cooperate if your partner cooperates. It pays to go for the stag if your partner is going for the stag. But the problem is one of trust. You have to trust that your partner is going to go for the stag, right? And another great book that I recommend if you're interested in issues related to social structure and cooperation is this by Brian Skierms, who talks about the stag hunt and the evolution of social structure and coordination. And a lot of people think that coordination games are easy to solve, but they're not. They're not trivial problems. There's no benefit to defect. Defect is mutually beneficial, and it's a self-interested behavior, but it doesn't, coordination games don't solve this problem of cooperation. Coordination games merely allow a cooperative equilibrium in terms of game theory, right? There is a cooperative equilibrium, hunt stag, but there's also another equilibrium, the non-cooperative one, hunt hare in the stag game, right? The difference is that one is riskier than the other, right? Hunting stag is risky because if you opt for stag and your partner opts for hare, you get nothing. And the hare can be taken by oneself, and so that's the less riskier payoff. And so it all comes down to this issue of trust. Who do you trust to follow the norms of behavior and to allow you to maximize your social benefit through collective action, right? One of the solutions that has been generated in game theory and other places is positive assortment, right? Or structure, social structure. Individuals who form groups with others who they can trust to share norms in common. If you can find people who are like you, who you can trust to follow the same institutional norms, then you can reap the benefits of coordination and the stag hunt, right? There's lots of ways that you can do that. Signaling is one way, right? But now, the classic models of cooperation have looked to genetic kinship as a mechanism for structure. And we all, some of us maybe are familiar with W.T. Hamilton's idea of kin selection, which predicts, all other things being equal, that we should associate with close kin, that cooperate, one can cooperate with close kin. It predicts that individuals will be more likely to favor kin than non-kin, and close kin more than distant kin. And this has been a stalwart in terms of theory to explain cooperation. But there are limitations to kin selection and the structure that can be formed via genetic kinship. And I just want to talk a little bit about that before I get to the Lamalerans. One is that there's this problem with group size, and there is an inverse relationship between relatedness and group size. And I'll show some data later on with the Lamalerans. But the larger the group, the less closely related individuals become, the lower the mean relatedness is within groups. And as we'll see, kin selection structure using genetic kinship works for small groups, but it becomes more difficult once groups become larger, right? And that's the case with Lamalera, as I'll show you. The other issue, and one that is more interesting perhaps, is that structure organized via genetic kinship produces ambiguous groups. Kinship structure is egocentric. Every individual has a different kinship network, unless you're siblings. And so it's, everybody, we exist within this network of overlapping kinship networks, which produces conflicts of interest. And let me give you an example. And the reason this is the case is because genetic kinship relationships are not transitive, right? And let me give you an example of what I mean by that, right? You see ego right here, and ego is equally related to his cousin A here, where R equals 0.125, for those of you familiar with that, and he's equally related to his cousin on his other side. But those two cousins, at least in an outbred population, are not related to each other at all. And so if ego wants to form a large group, he's motivated equally to cooperate with A and B, but A and B are not necessarily motivated to cooperate with each other. And this becomes a problem as you form larger and larger groups, is that folks have conflicts of interest with their genetic relatives, because no kinship network is the same for various individuals, right? Now, this problem was understood by the early structural functionalists, the sort of pre-Schneider kinship folk back in the 50s and 60s, who understood the problems of organizing by consanguineal kinship. And they argued that lineage systems were evolved as an adaptation to solve these structural problems, right? In lineage systems, social identity is inherited from one parent or the other, right? If it's a patrilineal system, you inherit your social identity, your kinship identity from your father, and you belong to your father's patriline, right? In matrilineal systems, you inherit your ID from your mother in matrilineal systems, right? What this does is it reduces conflicts of interest, right? There's unambiguous group identity. You don't have the problems associated with consanguineal kinship as a structuring factor, right? Now, it does produce problems in that you essentially disenfranchise half your genetic kin. But the arguments of the structural functionalists was that there's huge collective action benefits realized, because you produce groups of individuals who all share unambiguously a group identity, right? And in lots of contexts where solidarity is important, you find lineage systems. So where warfare is common, where corporate property is an issue, where inheritance is important, you find these lineage systems developing, right? Okay. Now, lineage systems are a type of cultural kinship, right? These are affinity based on symbolically mediated and socially constructed identities. Now, when I was in graduate school, I mean, I would never have predicted that as a behavioral ecologist I would be arguing that humans are organized by socially constructed identities. But we are. All right, and I was very happy. I've just finished reading this book by Bernard Chappius, where he talks about cultural kinship, and I was so pleased to see people looking back at the old structural functionalists and relating human kinship back to the legacies we see in non-human primate kinship. And it's just sad to me that it's not a cultural anthropologists, it's primatologists that are doing it, but it's good, right? All right, so with that background, I want to talk a little bit now about this research design. What I'm doing here is I'm using hunt group affiliation data from these whalers who I'll introduce next. These whalers, they go out in groups of between 8 and 11, and they affiliate regularly to hunt these very large animals. And I'm going to test 3 models of structures to see if what best predicts the affiliation we see among these whalers, right? The first is genetic kinship. The next is systems of unilineal descent. These are patrilineal folks. And the last is affinal ties of marriage. And the idea is to test to see which, if any, is better at predicting how the whale hunters affiliate in these hunting coalitions. All right, and the predictions are pretty basic, right? The lineage hypothesis predicts that lineage membership is going to explain a larger proportion of the variance in affiliation among the hunting groups, right? So men who belong to the same lineage are more likely to affiliate, right? The second hypothesis predicts that genetic kinship is going to explain more of the variance in affiliation, right? So essentially hunters who are more closely related are more likely to affiliate. All right. Now, if you're awake out there, you realize that there's a problem here, because lineage and kinship are correlated, right? People who belong to the same lineage are more likely to be genetically related, and you have this issue here. But I'm going to use some statistics that will hopefully, do sort of segregate those, pull those apart, and allow us to look at each effect separately. Okay. And finally, there's the issue, the prediction related to affinal relationships. Right? Affinal relationships will explain a larger proportion of the variance in affiliation among hunting groups, and I look at father-in-law, son-in-law, and brother-in-law pairs to see if they're more likely to affiliate during these cruises, these hunts. All right. All right. So that's the research design. Let me give you a little bit of ethnographic background before we get into the results. Lamalera is a village located on the island of Lambata in the Indonesian archipelago, right where the arrow points. It's a village of about 1,200. They're marine foragers. They have no agriculture to speak of. They are organized into 21 patra clans that are further subdivided into sublineages, and it's those sublineages that organize the whaling operations that are based on whaling boats called tèna, and these are the boat houses, and the boats are kept in these boat houses, and it was a wonderful place to collect data because everything happened on this beach. I could sit myself on this beach and watch the boats leave, and they would all come back. Right. Let's see. A few things about their social organization. Levi-Strauss would be very happy with these people because they're organized into asymmetric marriage alliances. So they have patrilineal descent. The clans are divided into 3 types, and the prescribed marriage is for women in type A clans to marry men in type B clans, and from women in type B clans to flow over to type C, and from C to type A, right? We have data to show that they follow this about 50% of the time. Right, about the other 25% they go the opposite direction, and then 25% they marry incest, well, not really incestually, but into the same clan, right? So they follow it, but not exactly. Okay, the clans own the whaling operations and the whaling boats corporately, and these boats, they're called tèna. They're handmade. There's no nails, it's all wood pegs. The sails are made from woven palm. These are really interesting bits of technology that they use to hunt these whales with. And the argument that I make is that hunting whales with these things are games of coordination in a variety of different ways that I'll talk about here, right? There are other ways that one can get protein. They can hunt in small boats called sampan, but return rates are significantly lower. So getting a group of guys together and organizing them into a whaling operation produces higher per capita returns than the alternative, just like in the stag hunt. But the key is getting the guys together, all down at the beach on the same day, and getting them to agree to the complex set of norms that is required to do this successfully. Okay, they hunt very large prey. Sperm whale is their primary prey. They also hunt other toothed cetaceans, and ray is also frequently taken. Right, and these are very large animals. Right, this is to scale, and so these are large, dangerous animals. And this is one of the reasons that attracted me to this field site, is because, as many of you know, hunting large game is thought to be important in our evolutionary history, and this is one of the few places that where they still do it on a regular basis. Right, so they hunt sperm whale and then ray, 3 species of ray. Whales provide most of the meat in terms of overall returns, but the ray, they get more ray by number. Let's see, what else? I'd mentioned that they don't really have any agriculture to speak of. They obtain carbohydrates, primarily corn and manioc, at barter markets that occur in the interior of the island with interior villages. And so it's like a lot of hunting and gathering groups where the carbohydrates are obtained through trade. One anecdotal thing about the whales, there's only one other village in all of Indonesia that hunts whales, and it's about 40 kilometers away on another island. And on that island, they hunt only baleen whales. And on this, in La Molera, they hunt toothed whales. And both villages say that the other kind of whale is too dangerous. Right? And so it's to me this sort of type of competitive exclusion, perhaps. Right? I don't know. It's just interesting. And they both also say that they have no history, though it's hard for me to believe that that's the case. I mean, given the fact that you have all of Indonesia and only 2 villages, and they're 40 kilometers apart, but they claim to have no history. And if you're interested in, there's a very interesting ethno-history of La Molera, and if you would like to ask me about it afterward, you can. They have this long diasporic story of, it's almost biblical in its scope of how they got to where they live. But so they go out and they hunt, and they form crew sizes. Here's the distribution of crew sizes, between 8 to 17. You have to have 8 guys to go hunt. If you can't get 8 guys down on the beach, nobody goes, nobody gets anything. Right? The mean is 11, and then sometimes you can have larger crew sizes, but those are fairly rare. Right? This is data from 802 hunts. Okay. What a typical crew looks like. I've argued in some papers that this is a weak link coordination problem. Like a weak link coordination problem is that you have to have a certain number of people involved in the cooperative venture. In this case, 8. If you can't get 8 guys down on the beach, nobody gets anything. And if any one of these guys thinks that 8 guys aren't going to be there, then they're going to do something else, and so it makes it difficult sometimes. But the Lamalerans are pretty good at getting everybody down there. Okay. Whaling occurs during the dry season from May till about October. They have 20 boats, and they go out in a fleet. Anywhere between 2 to 20 boats will go out on a given day, and they leave in the morning, and they row out and then pop their sails, and it's quite spectacular going out. And they hunt in like I said, in a fleet, looking for signs of whales. When they see a whale, they'll drop the sail and start rowing madly after the whale. And when they get close enough, the harpooner who positions himself on that harpooner's platform, when he's close enough, he'll just leap off the front of the whale and let him have it. The whale is usually not very happy and can do 2 things. One, take the boat on what's called an Nantucket sleigh ride. That's what the American whalers call it, just pulling the boat across at high speeds. Sometimes the whale will dive and take the boat right down, and then the crew jumps out and gets picked up by guys in the other boats. What they'll do then is either other boats will spear the whale, or the second and third boats will tie on to the first boat and tire the whale out, and then they hop in and then kill it. Right? It's very dangerous, as you can guess. A lot of people get hurt. A lot of people get killed. They were missionized by Catholics. Interestingly, they're all Catholic, which is kind of odd for Indonesia. But they have a mass every year where they memorialize the dead at sea. And so I have all the mortality data, which is great, going back about 100 years, and compared it to OSHA data. And the mortality rates for these folks are as high as the most dangerous job in the United States, which is fishing. Fishing. Crab, you've seen the deadliest catch? Yeah, stuff like that. I mean, this is extremely dangerous, but it's interesting that the mortality rates are almost the same. I mean, really high, but almost the same. All right. Okay, they kill the whale, and then they bring it back to shore, which takes some time. Bring it back up on the beach where they butcher it. Right. And this involves, it's 2 days process, and it's quite involved. All right. Just some scenes of butchering. Right. Okay. Butchering has also, I've also written that butchering is a coordination problem. Right. There are an infinite number of ways that you can butcher a whale. Right? I mean, a kilo of meat is a kilo of meat, but you all have to agree on who gets what, right? And it's you're down on the beach, and there's a lot of guys with big knives, and you don't want conflict on the beach when this is happening. And there's almost no discussion. It's so interesting when you're down on, people are talking on the beach when they're butchering, but there's no discussion of how to butcher it, because everybody knows. It's just sort of, it's part of the social norm, right? And this is, there's also different, the crew gets shares. There are corporate shares that go to the, it's like shareholders in the corporation that get shares. The technology specialists get shares, the smith, the sail maker, who else? The boat builder gets a share. The crew, of course, gets a share. The lord of the land, that's a special clan, they get a share, right? So very interesting. Okay, all right. So that's a little bit about what it's like in La Molera. And what I want to talk about now is a little bit about the methods. These are data that were collected a while ago now, about 10 years ago. And we took crew we ID'd all the crew members from all 20 tèna for 853 hunts that took place over the course of 80 days during the, well, there's 2 summers there. All right, so we have over 9,000 man hunts and over 290 men who ever hunted. So it's a fairly large data set, right? Over 800 hunts. And we were able to identify lineage membership and kinship through interviews, and we were able to calculate the coefficients of relatedness using Ed Hagen's descent program, and we were also able to get data on affinal relationships, right? So we had good pedigrees, so we were able to determine father-in-law relationships and son-in-law relationships, right? And what I did is essentially a social network analysis. And what I did is created an affiliation matrix where affiliation was scored as the number of times that 2 hunters crewed on the same boat on the same day. Right? So essentially the matrix, so all the IDs of all the men are listed here and also across the columns, and that the cells are populated with the number of times they went out together on the same boat on the same day. Right? So this is essentially an affiliation matrix, right? And this is the dependent variable. This is what I want to explain. This is the variance in this matrix. Right? Okay. Now, in order to reduce the data to manageable size, I did a multidimensional scaling and k-means analysis, and the results, some of the results are presented here. Right, each point is a hunter, and clusters were extracted using a k-means test, and essentially what you can see here are clusters of men who regularly affiliate, and I was able to identify the boats, right? So they easily are ID'd with the boats, and these are the boats' names: Praso, Sapang, Baka, Tèna, Bodi, Sapang, right? And so these are clusters. When I refer to clusters of men, right, these are the clusters to which I'm referring, okay? And there's some overlap, but that disappears with the 3rd dimension, all right? Okay. So using these clusters as samples, I asked first whether hunters positively assorted according to lineage. Right? And you can't use a chi-square because there are a lot of frequencies that had fewer than 5 occurrences, so I used the Goodman and Kruskal's lambda proportional reduction in error test. And it essentially compares assignments to clusters made with the knowledge of lineage identity to assignments made randomly, right, to see if they're associating more commonly with lineage members than not. And the result, the lambda is nearly 0.6, highly significant, which means that if you know the lineage identity of the man, it reduces the error over 60% versus random. Right? So what that means is that there's a high association between crews and lineage identity, basically. Right? So we know that hunters are assorting to lineage, but what about genetic kinship? Here what I did is I compared the null measurement here, that is the average genetic relatedness among all the men, to the average relatedness between hunters who share a lineage. And you can see that there's a significant difference, right? Y, this is the coefficient of relatedness, right there. Sort of the null is a mean of 0.006. The within lineage degree of relatedness on average is 0.116, nearly as much as cousins. So, not surprisingly, what this tells you is that lineage members are more closely related than expected by chance, which is shouldn't surprise any of you, right? No, okay, there we go. So, if hunters are assorting non-randomly according to lineage membership, and lineage members are more closely related than expected by chance, then it's expected that affiliated men are also more closely related than expected by chance, and that's exactly what we find, right? So here's the null again, And these are the clusters that I mentioned earlier, and that is the actual the mean of the 630 hunts, the crews. And you see that they are more related than expected by chance, which is what you'd expect, right? So there's N clusters and 853 actual hunts. So again, this isn't very surprising. It's all very significant. Okay, so, but this begs the question, right? Are hunters affiliating with kin, or are they affiliating with fellow lineage members, and the high degree of kinship is just because they're associating with lineage members, right? And that the relation, the high degree of relatedness is sort of epiphenomenal. Right? Well, to look at that, please, oh, there we go, okay. So to answer this question, what I did is I used some matrix permutation tests, and these tests can be thought of as essentially multiple regression or regression with matrices. Okay, and I had the one dependent variable there, which is the affiliation matrix that I discussed earlier. That's where affiliation is scored again as the sum of all the times that the hunters hunted together on the same boat. And the independent variables were the genetic kinship matrix, which is this matrix with the same structure, yet it's populated with the coefficient relatedness scores between the hunters, right? So every cell contains the coefficient of relatedness between each pair of men, right? That's what this one is. This one is the lineage matrix, which scores a 1 if the men share the same lineage, and a 0 if they don't. And then this is the affinal matrix, which scores a 1 if the men share a affinal relationship, and a 0 if they don't. And I used UCINet, which is a statistical program that will run these. Very nice. And to see which, if any of these, explains the greatest variance in the affiliation matrix. All right. So here are the results. And first I did the univariate analysis, right? And so I looked at first genetic relationship, right? And found that the genetic relationship explained about 4%. Right, you can't see that. About 4%, R-squared is about 4% of the variance in the affiliation matrix, right? Very significant, 0.000, right? If I looked at lineage alone, the amount of variance explained is about more than twice as much, and the standardized parameter estimate is higher, so the strength of the effect is higher, right? So lineage seems to be explaining more of the variance than kinship. And then I looked at affinal, the affinal relationships, and though it gives a significant effect, it explains none of the variance. So at least when you're looking at it in terms of the univariate effects, lineage seems to have a stronger effect. Genetic kinship seems to explain less, and affinal relationships doesn't seem to explain anything at all.
I'm not familiar with the matrix statistics, but does the scaling that you use matter for the effect size? So the fact that lineage relatedness goes from 0 to 1. Mm-hmm. So if you're the member of the same lineage, you got scored a 1, and if not, a 0. Whereas your R's go between 0 and say 0.5, right? If they're brothers. I mean, does it matter what scale that you pick? That's
a good question. I can't answer that right now.
What the effect size is going to end up being? Do you know? No. Okay. It's a rank thing.
Okay, I can't answer that right now. We could talk about that afterwards. All right. All right. What I then did is ran some multiple regression, and the first was kinship and lineage, and what the result was kind of interesting to me anyway. Is that when you add a kinship along with lineage, the R-square value doesn't change. That essentially by adding kinship doesn't increase the amount of variance explained in the affiliation matrix when you add it along with lineage. And if you look at the standardized parameter estimates, you see that lineage has a much larger effect, power here than kinship. So it appears that that kinship washes out. Right? If you add, if you do multivariate with kinship, lineage, and the affinal matrix, you find that again, affinal, adding the affinal variable doesn't provide any additional explanatory power as well. So it appears that that lineage, that people are organizing primarily according to lineage, and that this effect we saw with kinship, the fact that people are more closely related than you'd expect, is simply a result of the fact that people are associating by lineage. Right? Let's see. Now. And this, I just pulled this today from David Nolan, who's a student of mine who has worked in La Molera, and he replicated the same results. Our data, the first data that I presented was from 1999. He did the same thing in 2006, and these are essentially the bars indicate the amount of variance explained with relatedness, lineage, and then lineage and relatedness, right? So you can see that that this is lineage, and this is lineage and relatedness, and so genetic relatedness doesn't really explain any more, right? Same here. This was again in 2006, right? That genetic relatedness doesn't add anything to the lineage for explaining the variance. He did an analysis looking at food sharing, though, and he found something quite different. He did a study that looked at the effect of lineage and genetic relatedness on the food sharing networks in La Molera, and found just the opposite, that people are sharing much more sharing with close genetic kin than they are with lineage members, right? And that's what the last. So if you add 16% of the variance is explained by genetic relatedness between the sharing partners. You add lineage and it really doesn't explain anything more.
Is the food sharing outside of the whale hunts? Or does it include?
Yeah, this sharing is what we call secondary sharing, right? Because they had the first distribution. Right, yeah, they do the distribution, then they get it back to their houses, and then the secondary sharing. And they seem to be sharing with close kin. When they're doing those secondary sharing, they don't seem to be sharing with lineage members, which is kind of interesting, right? So, I mean, as I'll talk about later, it seems that structure through genetic kinship plays a role in some cases, and in other cases not so much. It all depends on the sort of the cooperative problem that needs to be solved. Sometimes lineage structure is useful, and sometimes it's not, it appears, right? So let me just review here. So hunters affiliate more strongly according to lineage membership than genetic kinship. And though crew members were more closely related than expected by chance, it's due to the partial correlation between lineage and kinship. Right? And the reason is, and if you think about it, right, you have pairs of equivalently related non-nuclear kin, right? They're just as likely to belong to different lineages, right, and not affiliate as they are to share a lineage and affiliate, right? So your kin related at 0.5, your brothers and your dad, they're all in the same lineage as you. Right? But once you get outside, your cousins are just as likely not to be in your lineage as in your lineage. And you're just as likely not to cooperate with them as you are. And so once you get outside very closely related kin, it doesn't have the resolution here. It doesn't, it doesn't tell you who to cooperate with, basically, right? You have to go to the lineage system. Okay, and again, affinal relationships are not important, which is interesting.
Question?
Sure.
So if you, with the kinship, if you broke it down into patrilineal and matrilineal kin, would you recover the lineage result? Because that's right. So, because you're lumping all the kin together, but if you just trace kinship through one line.
say this again. So if you
So if you just looked at your paternal kin or your maternal kin, you broke up kin that way?
oh, genetic kin?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's essentially what
Recovering the lineage then?
yeah, I mean, yeah, you'd just be recreating the lineage. Yeah, yeah. I mean, what lineage does, I mean, it's interesting. It's a sort of arbitrary splitting of genetic kin into in-group members and out-group members. I mean, it's arbitrary to a certain extent. I mean, it could be maternal kin, it could be paternal kin, right? And as you know, if you've as anthropologists, we know that this is extremely common, but it is a social construct. But it allows, as we'll see, highly dense, large groups of dense networks to form that are you can't form with genetic using genetic means. And I just we have some time here. This chart shows the number of relationships that exist within the sample of hunters, right? And this is for 189 hunters. So 189 hunters, this is the number of relationships of different types, these different kinship types that exist within the population of hunters, right? So there's 17,000 potential relationships. So you imagine a matrix, 189 by 189, right? So it's a lot of potential relationships. Not very many father-in-law, son-in-law relationships, only 5, which is really interesting, and we can talk about that, right? Only 51 brother-in-law relationships. And then you get into the kinship relationships, 173 cousin relationships, 88, R equals 0.25, most of those are uncle-nephew relationships. Only 115 very close nuclear family relationships. This is brother-brother, father-son relationships. Lineage relationships, though, there's over 600. So there's lots of lineage relationships within the group, right? Now, what I wanted to do to continue talking about this, I wanted to introduce 2 terms from social network analysis. One is density, and the other is is component. And density is the number of actual links in a network, or network component divided by the maximum number of links possible. And these are, so you think about a network as being dense. There's lots, people share lots of relationships, right, if a network is dense, right? These are direct reciprocated relationships that you might think of opportunities to share information, sort of act collectively or trust one another, right? Denser groups could be argued to suffer less in terms of transaction costs because people are likely to share institutional norms, right, within the group. You could have networks where lots of people are connected, but also networks where people aren't so connected. And when people are very connected, we say the network is dense, right? And the component, a component is essentially a portion of a network, right, where the actors are connected, right? And what we can look at, what I did is you can look at how the different types of structuring principles produce either more or less components of different size and then components of different density. And that's what I did. And I don't want you to look, I hate when people show these tables like this, but basically when you look at the number of components and the mean component size and the density of the components for groups organized by these different types of organizing principles, right, R equals 0.5 or 0.25, affinal relationships, and then lineage. What we find is that for close genetic kin, you produce many small, dense components, right? So you have clumps of closely related men, but they're small, right? The mean was 3, right? For more distant genetic kin, you have fewer components. They're larger, but they're less dense. Right? For affinal relationships, or for networks produced through affinal relationships, the components are small and less dense. But for lineage, right, networks produced via lineage principles, you have many large and very dense components, right, which is...
For over what time scale are you constructing your networks?
Okay, this is the networks of men who hunted in that one year.
1 year.
1 year, right? Exactly. Yeah. Okay. So, and to give you some idea, and this is related to the problem of trying to organize via genetic kinship, right? This chart shows density, right? That is the number of actual links in a network component divided by the maximum number of links. For components greater than 3, formed via genetic kinship principles, right? So what you find, the squares are networks formed by relationships of r equals 0.5. The circles are r equals 0.25, and then the triangles are cousin relationships, r equals 0.125. And what you find is that as component size increases, right, density drops off. Right? So you can form, you know, it's hard to form large groups of closely related kin, and when you do form larger groups, they become less dense and more ephemeral, right? And if density is a good thing when it comes in terms of sharing institutional norms, you have a hard time with genetic, right? The other issue, and I mentioned this earlier, and I wanted to make sure I showed this, is that, and this is related to the density issue, right, is that it's hard to form large groups of closely related kin. Now, having a larger group is good when you're trying to form whaling operations in La Molera. And this lists all the clans in La Molera, and this is the number of members, right? So there's a lot of variability. Some clans have lots of members, and some don't have so many. The number on the top indicates the number of tèna, the number of whaling operations that clan produces, right? And what you see is that as clan size increases, the number of tèna that a clan can produce increases, right? So the more members you have, the more whaling operations you can generate, which makes sense. But kinship declines with group size, like I mentioned, right? And so this is the log R, the coefficient of relatedness for the hunters, for their lineage size. So as lineage size increases, the average coefficient of relatedness for hunters decreases. And so having a larger group is good, but you can't have a large group of closely related kin, right? Because of these density issues that we talked about, right? Yeah, this just gives you some idea of what these networks look like. And I use network analysis will allow you to produce visual representations of the networks, right? So each dot is a man, and the lines are the relationships. And in this case, r equals 0.25. So it shows you the components that are formed by close genetic relationships, right? Brother, brother, father, son. You have lots of small groups of brothers and father-son teams, right? The panel B there adds r equals 0.25 relationships. This adds cousin relationships, and then that produces, that's all even with some coefficients less, right? So it produces these large sort of tenuous networks that are not conducive to, I mean, they're not very dense, and where there are lots of conflicts of interest because people have genetic interests across the network, right? And in fact, this is another view of that last panel, right? And what I wanted to show you was where individual crews fit within the genetic network, right? So this shows the entire genetic network, and I'm going to show you 6 slides pretty quickly that show you where men from different crews lie, right? So this is tèna. This is the boat that went out the most. And you can see that the men who crew tèna are spread out across the the genetic network, right? Which is, they may, I don't have the lineage identities, but they belong to the same lineage, but they are separated by some distance in the genetic network, right? This is tèna, right? This is Manula Blolo, right? So some groups of closely related men, and the ones that are closely related are often brothers, right? But again, once you get outside the nuclear family, you often have to look elsewhere, right? That's a very closely related group, Demosapan. Clueless, right? Clueless. Prososapan. Right. Okay. I haven't talked too much about the affinal kin. The affinal networks are extremely, well, not very dense and not very large. Right. Affinal kin tend to be rare, especially father-in-laws, and that's because men tend to marry late here. Not everybody's married, so not everyone doesn't have a wife, and fathers tend to be older and not out hunting, and so you don't find them in the networks. All right. Okay, and this is the lineage components for the hunter sample for the lineage. For lineages, right? And so as you can see, social structure by lineage forms these relatively large, dense networks, components, right, which is ideal for some of these issues related to solving the coordination problems. These people share social norms. I mean, they inherit, as we'll talk about later in the discussion maybe, is that not only do you share a social identity, do you inherit a social identity, but you share and inherit a whole set of social norms about how to behave on the beach, how to butcher the whale, what the proper way to distribute the meat, right? And within these lineage networks, everybody shares without question the same social norms, right? Without a conflict of interest. Now. Okay, so I'll conclude right here. So in order to solve some of these coordination problems, you have to figure out how to preferentially assort with others who you can trust. If you're going to solve these coordination games, if you want to solve the stag hunt, if you want to be a successful whale hunter, you have to determine who you can trust to share these norms, right? It looks like genetic kinship is okay for small groups, but it doesn't seem to scale up. Right? You can't form large groups, sufficiently large for whale hunting. Right? Affinal kinship doesn't seem to be very important here in La Molera, but it may be in some certain circumstances. And we can talk about that later. I did a paper looking at analyzing the famous Yanomamo axe fight, where affinal kin is really, really important. And it may be related to the fact that women were involved in that, and there are no women here, right? Lineage systems notches up group size. I think lineage systems, just like the old structural functionalists explained to us years ago, is that social structure organized around lineage systems notches up group size. It allows larger groups to form than you can form via genetic kinship, right? And finally, I'd argue that it's this culturally transmitted social identity that's the key to human ultrasociality, right? That being able to organize in ways beyond those predicted by kin selection is what really has allowed us to form these super large groups of unrelated people and do things like hunt whales. So that's it.